This is Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us once again, we haven't talked to him for a while, always look forward to it, Max Blumenthal, writer. He is the senior editor of the Gray Zone Project. He has a couple new pieces out in Harper's and the Real News Network, I believe it is, and he's the author of a number of books, which you may know, including Goliath, the 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza, and Republican Gomorrah. And welcome back.
Good to be back. I'm always around the corner if you need me.
All right, good to know, good to know. All right, so Max, there's so much going on, and I'm not sure we even want to talk about it all. But one of the things that I wrote about this week and that I really wanted your take on was we have the killing, the brutal killing of Jamal Khashoggi in Turkey by the Saudis. We have this ludicrous cover-up and Trump's bad review of it, which is part of what I wrote about. But it's almost as if, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it, it's almost as if people are discovering for the first time that maybe the Saudis aren't the nice, colorful, princely royal family characters that Thomas Friedman and others have been telling them that they are, that there's this newfound sense of indignation. And I was wondering, A, how real that was, because I have my feelings about that, and B, how it is they couldn't have noticed something like, for example, a massive humanitarian disaster caused by Saudi bombing in Yemen, just to pick one. So, or the repression of feminists and Shiites within Saudi Arabia itself. So, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I can only kind of reinforce what you just said. But it's been interesting watching this. It's been fascinating watching this unfold because Saudi Arabia, I mean, I don't even need to say it. It's a theocratic monarchy. I believe they were operationally involved in 9/11. I can talk about that. Nobody in the U.S. is walking around talking about Saudi Arabia being a wonderful kingdom that plays a positive role in the world. It exports Wahhabism to destabilize large regions of the world. I mean, it's attempted to poison Islam on the global stage. I mean, I hold it in the same contempt that I do the state of Israel for what it's done to Judaism. But nobody in the U.S. feels positively about Saudi Arabia except for our elites, who are the ones who are bought off and have skin in the game. And what we've seen in the past week, where the New York Times finally decides, they made an executive decision to talk about the worst humanitarian crisis in the world in Yemen, put it on the front page in this giant splash next to, the Saudi cover-up about basically sawing a journalist into 15 pieces, Khashoggi. I used the term journalist loosely. He was actually a Saudi publicist for most of his career. In any case, what's been so fascinating to watch is how the media follows in lockstep with elite opinion on Saudi Arabia and has waited for this moment where one of their own, someone they considered to be a part of their media industry, has been killed, so they can talk about the full picture of Saudi Arabia, or much of it. But, if you go back to 2015, 2016, the New York Times, Washington Post, especially CNN, they were pumping the Saudi agenda in Syria, where Saudi Arabia was actually maintaining through proxies control over large swaths of the state of Syria. Then you had Mohammed bin Salman come in, and he has this tour of the U.S. where the red carpet is rolled out to him by Oprah, by Bill Clinton, Elon Musk. Who else did he meet with? Mark Zuckerberg. Everybody who's who of our kind of hovercraft elite. I actually had an email passed on to me by a woman named Amber Cousteau, who it said, we're rushing back to LA to meet with MBS because her husband, who is the son or grandson of Jacques Cousteau, was building a resort that MBS was creating on the Red Sea, and he was overseeing the ecological side of it. So they'd even bought off Jacques Cousteau's family. They invested $400 million in Endeavor, which is the biggest talent agency in Hollywood. MBS's rival, Walid bin Talal, owns a large stake in Time Warner, which controls CNN. So the Saudis had, and then they had basically been paying Washington Post columnists while Jamal Khashoggi was there. Ed Rogers, who's a big Republican lobbyist in town at BGM Group, was a Washington Post contributor. He was lobbying for Saudi Arabia. So Dennis Ross, he was lobbying for Saudi Arabia, constantly pumping up Saudi Arabia. Then all of a sudden this happens. It becomes inconvenient. And now everyone is on their back feet who previously promoted Mohammed bin Salman. It's really embarrassing to them, but at the same time, it's like, okay, I'll take it. Like, fine, if this is what it takes, and we are going to change our relationship with this country, which is one of the most, if not the most dangerous alliances that the United States has in the world, then I'm not going to just sit around and troll you all day, although I want to. But it's really interesting just to see how the sausage is made in Washington and how the media follows in lockstep with this hovercraft elite that is completely out of step with the public that the media is supposed to serve.
Well, and I also think there's another dimension to this, which is an almost sociopathic lack of empathy on the part of our elites when it comes to, let's say, the children of the fact that roughly half of the children under 5 in Yemen are now so severely malnourished that they will be stunted for the rest of their lives, or the fact that a child, according to the UN Secretary General's office, dies in Yemen every 10 minutes from lack of nutrition. The fact that that does not move them, but while the admittedly horrific murder of a writer moves them, it's because they may have met him at a cocktail party at one time or another. That shows to me...
I've even met him. I mean, he's met everybody.
And that, by the way, is not being, I'm not being dismissive of the horror of the murder. Far from it, but I'm saying that, does it take somebody in your social circle before you even notice that a regime is extraordinarily brutal?
Yeah. I mean, we can call it elite empathy disorder.
Yeah.
EED.
Right. If you think you might suffer from... So I wrote a piece about this for Counterpunch called Prez Pan's Saudi Shocker Stays Mum on Mass Murder Prequel. And it was based on the idea that Trump... See, it's based, first of all, although I didn't say it this way, I think Trump in some ways is the id of the American elites. I think that he speaks what they think and feel in many cases. Yeah. So here's what Donald Trump had to say before basically saying, well, probably they didn't do it. It might have been, maybe they're right, and it was some rogue actors, or maybe there was a fistfight. Somebody told Trump he had to criticize them for this. So this is what he said, and I'm sure you've read it, but I'll quote it anyway. Quote, they had a very bad original concept. It's like Hollywood producer talk. It was carried out poorly, and the cover-up was one of the worst in the history of cover-ups. Very simple, bad deal should never have been thought of. In other words, at no point is he really critiquing the murder. He's just critiquing it from on a performance level. It was bad theater. It was poorly executed. Are you reading it any differently than I'm reading it?
Like the concept behind it. I mean, Lindsey Graham had this incredible appearance on Fox and Friends where he's basically like, y'all are embarrassing me. I've been your biggest ally in the Senate, and now all of a sudden you're going to go and do this to me? And it's kind of like, it's too blatant. You know what I mean? It's just, this is too much. I mean, the guy walks in to the consulate and he doesn't walk out.
Right.
And he's like one of your top targets, and you've got, MBS's online troll army commanders, Saud al-Ghatani, running around on Twitter threatening Saudi dissidents with assassination. It's like, it's too blatant.
Too on the nose.
They killed a Washington Post contributor who's a permanent resident of the U.S. in the most blatant, obvious, stupid way possible. But they've been doing blatant stuff for a long time. I mean, look at the way the princes behave. I read one story about a Saudi prince who was accused of rape, I think in London, and he said that he fell and his penis fell into the woman. I mean, that actually was reported. That's like his excuse. So they behave like this all over the world and get away with it thanks to Lindsey Graham. So yeah, you're right. It's just a matter of them being embarrassing their friends.
And what it does is, if you follow the money, that flows from Saudi Arabia to think tanks in this country and God knows where else too. And I've been saying for a long time, if you really want to take Trump down, investigate his Saudi money connections, but he's by no means an exception in that case, in that sense. So if you follow the money that's all over this town, is professorships endowed, chairs endowed in different schools, it's think tanks, it's this, it's that, then what you really find, Lindsey Graham is uncharacteristically honest there too, because he doesn't even pretend to have empathy. He's basically saying, you're making my life difficult. That's like a mob boss to me, saying, you committed a killing on my territory. This is an embarrassment to me. I mean, maybe I don't.
He said, then he becomes an imperial lord, and he says, y'all need to have some good people there. You just need to remove MBS. Like he can just do that. And that's also the relationship that Saudi Arabia has fostered with the U.S., where the U.S. leadership gets to pick and choose who's in charge. And I think actually the United States is in store for a terrible reckoning with Saudi Arabia because of MBS. He's a different kind of figure than they've been accustomed to in the past. John Brennan is one of the people pounding the table and leading the charge against MBS. I'm referring to the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman,
right,
who's effectively in charge because the Saudi King Salman, is basically like Ronald Reagan circa 1988. Like he's looking at a wall and drooling and not knowing what's going on. MBS, 33, 34 years old, represents a totally new generation. The U.S. supported him because he was going to be like a Pinochet figure who was going to open up the economy to a massive American investment, start privatizing Aramco, the state-sponsored Saudi oil company, and at the same time kind of rule with an iron fist and enact America's will via Israel and the UAE across the Middle East against Iran. So perfect, it looks great, except MBS is his own man, and he has centered the entire state and royal family around himself. We saw what he did at the Ritz, where he took...
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because basically U.S. sends him all this love as soon as he becomes the de facto dictator of this country. First thing he does is he takes all these billionaires and millionaires who are also spreading a lot of money around the U.S. and have a lot of connections here, and he takes over the Ritz Hotel, commandeers it, takes them there, starts torturing them until they start giving him their money, right? And isn't that essentially what happened?
I mean, that's what we think happened. What really happened is he was basically isolating all of his internal opponents and centering state power around himself, whereas power had actually been atomized in the past, and there were not checks and balances, but Saudi Arabia would act based on the consensus of all the princes and many of the royals. So basically, I was talking about John Brennan. Brennan, he was, we all know he's the former...
You mean that hero of the resistance, John Brennan, former CIA director?
Yeah, the woke John Brennan. Former CIA director. He was actually the CIA station chief in Riyadh under Bill Clinton, and he was Obama's Saudi outsourced brain. So he convinced Obama to back the Saudi war on Yemen in 2015. And then when there was a change of the guard and King Abdullah died, John Brennan wanted his old counterpart from his days in Riyadh, Prince Nayef, to be the crown prince. Nayef was the security chief of Saudi Arabia. He had all the files. He basically was who John Brennan he was John Brennan combined with James Comey, but even more powerful. Problem was, he had gotten shot in an Al-Qaeda attack years ago and had suffered enormous pain and became addicted to painkillers, possibly cocaine. He was a big partier and his brain was completely addled. So along comes Mohammed bin Salman out of the blue. They didn't have any dossier on him. They didn't really know who this cat was. And then he gets in there and immediately starts consolidating control, gets all the old figures out, knows how to get the U.S. on his side, runs and intensifies the Saudi lobbying campaign, has everybody under his finger. At the same time, he's doing something the U.S. really doesn't like, John Brennan doesn't like. That's something Nayef would not have done, which is he's making arms deals with Russia. He's making plans to buy Russia's S-300, S-400 anti-aircraft system, which is just the best. It's the gold standard. He is selling oil to China, and he's selling it. He's getting paid in gold-backed yuan. In other words, they're not using dollars in the transactions. He's pissing the U.S. off. And now that he feels betrayed by the West, and even Donald Trump, who he thought he owned, that they had basically consolidated control of him at the orb, while Steve Bannon was in the back passing out his business card. And the Saudis have put on several conferences for Steve Bannon in town here quietly. All of a sudden, he feels betrayed by the West. He's going to move east. If the U.S. continues to call for him to be ousted, he is not going anywhere. I thought maybe there was a chance he'd be ousted, and maybe there is. I don't want to make predictions, but what we have to understand is that as part of this cover-up, he's ousted 16 people who are in his inner circle, and these are people who are in charge of the intelligence services, like Ahmed Asiri, who we've been hearing about a lot, the deputy intelligence chief. And who's taken charge of the intelligence services? Who's filled their positions? Who's taken charge of Saudi Arabia's online operations, which are much more potent than Russia's? Mohammed bin Salman. He's consolidated control through this episode. And I think that he will increasingly move away from the U.S. if the U.S. wants to put pressure on. And for the first time, we're seeing U.S. sanctions on his inner circle. So Washington actually is going to have to, official Washington, decide, do we want to lose? Do we want to, value our geostrategic imperatives, which means basically assisting in this cover-up? Or do we want to put on a moral show? Of course we know what they're going to do.
Right, of course. No, again, we're talking with Max Blumenthal, writer, and so much more. And so we have a situation where this guy's consolidated power. I would have said, even without everything you just said, which I learned a lot from, I would have already said that they're going to
Trump said the arms deals, Lockheed Martin. He always says Lockheed instead of Lockheed. It's weird. Lockheed Martin. He named Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. $110 billion of arms sales. We've signed the deal, but the arms haven't gone through, and Trump wants them to go through. That is jobs. I mean, we're running an economy based on military Keynesianism. That's a ton of jobs in Washington. Look at all the luxury condos going up around here. Right. Who lives in? That's all the contractors moving in. So. Yeah,
I wonder. I've always wondered who spends all that money. So you have a situation where I've felt already that there's a certain element of kind of ritual chastising that takes place, but that at the end of the day, we're going to keep helping them in Yemen. I mean, nobody has said, okay, let's stop providing military assistance, which we provide, as well as the weapons that we provide in order to target buses filled with school children and other civilians in Yemen. No sign that's going to stop. A lot of think tanks around here depend on Saudi money to keep going. A lot of politicians depend on those relationships. You have a national security establishment that believes that is a tactically critical relationship. Maybe I'm wrong, but I put the chances of this being any more than a ritual chest beating that will be followed by business as usual at approaching zero.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to put this one away, though. I mean, you have the kind of journalism media industry who are always kind of clamoring about themselves being under attack by Trump and everything. They're not going away, and they're continuing to make noise about this. And they represent an important component of elite power architecture in Washington and elsewhere, along the Acela Corridor. So this is a tough one to cover up. I don't know how they're going to do it, but I mean, it's obvious like what the Trump administration wants to do and what so many people in Washington want to do. And this has been a really embarrassing week. And Saudi Arabia has really lost a lot of soft power in Washington. I think they've lost soft power, period. They no longer have the ability to persuade the U.S. to do what it wants without either threats or just simply asserting their will. And it's going to take a long time to get it back. As long as Mohammed bin Salman is there, I mean, that's basically my ultimate point. As long as Mohammed bin Salman is there, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia's special relationship will fray. And I think, honestly, in the long run, that could be a good thing, especially for Yemen. The less support that Saudi Arabia has from the West, the harder it is for them to be able to create the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And by the way, I want to suggest to the Washington Post that they make a Yemeni child a guest columnist or a columnist.
I think that's an excellent idea.
Maybe we'll care about them.
Right. No,
their
exactly.
deaths.
Exactly. I mean, the sociopathic lack of empathy definitely extends to our pundit class, which reminds me to tell you, Max Blumenthal, that we didn't greet one another.
Iran, we need to bomb Iran.
I ran into Tom Friedman the other day on the street. It was one of the extra warm days, and he was wearing shorts and white socks, and you know, there was a sort of moment of recognition, and it made me realize that, you know, he's really been an extraordinary player in all of this. Also, by the way, and I bring that up for absolutely no valuable reason at all, but also wanted to point out to your point about what they're doing to really their corrupted version of Islam, their deeply destructive version of Islam that they're promoting everywhere. I don't think I've written about this ever, but I was in an aid group that went into Albania when it opened to the West for the first time in 40 years after the reign of Enver Hoxha, and was basically a garrison country, but it was historically Muslim and a very sophistic kind of, you know, peaceful Islam had been the rule in Albania. And it had been open less than a month to the West when I was staying on the square in Tirana, in the main square. And the Saudis were already there, flashing money, building a mosque, making sure that they decided who the imam was going to be and that it was their type of Wahhabi Islam and all that. And they're doing this all over the world. So they are the people creating the kind of unnecessary religious polarity as well as other forms of mayhem that are totally unnecessary.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up. And it's unfortunate that, you know, the Islamophobes and the kind of anti-Muslim industry has kind of seized the narrative on this one because, you know, it's not exactly a source of controversy within the Muslim world to be highly critical of Wahhabism and the role that Saudi Arabia has played. Also in projecting anti-Shia prejudice, a genocidal anti-Shia prejudice across the Middle East. And I think that's one of the worst facets of Saudi Arabia's projection of power is sectarianism. But, you know, I don't know why no one's talking about this and why we haven't talked about this. One of the few people talking about it is Kristen Breitweiser, who was the wife of one of the pilots killed on 9/11. She's one of the 9/11 widows who lobbied for JASTA, this bill that would have allowed bereaved family members of 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia. Why do they want to sue Saudi Arabia? Because Saudi Arabia had an operational role in 9/11. Now, we constantly hear about these 15 cats who flew in with the Tiger team into Istanbul to cut up Jamal Khashoggi with a bone saw, and then they like went out with like his body in pouches, like just such a macabre scene. What about the 15 Saudis who flew into the World Trade Center on 9/11? Was that just some coincidence that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi? Well, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, first of all, were made Bosnian citizens. They were sent by Saudi Arabia to participate in the fight in Bosnia as U.S. proxies. And then they were, in August 2001, at an al-Qaeda summit in Malaysia, which the CIA was monitoring but curiously did not supply information about to the FBI. Al-Midhar and Hazmi were then flown to Los Angeles and picked up by a Saudi intelligence agent posing as an employee of the Saudi aviation agency named Omar Bayoumi at the airport, took them to a meal, then rented their apartments and continued to pay for their apartment leases through Saudi intelligence agencies while they were mysteriously meeting figures in black cars at night and taking flight lessons. Nawaf and Hasbi were the muscle hijackers on 9/11, who were also in and out of the King Fahd Mosque in LA, which is a Saudi-funded and created mosque to, you know, project their power across the world. So it's pretty obvious that there was some kind of Saudi role. And then Bayoumi was mysteriously just kind of flown out right after 9/11, along with those Saudi diplomats who were flown out by the Bush administration, basically evacuated instead of extradited as they should have been. And
by the way, when we say some kind of role, I suppose that could mean elements within the Saudi intelligence services. It might not be an official government decision, but as with other countries, there are elements within the intelligence services who clearly could have been part of this.
Well, just to wrap it up, I mean, there were 28 pages in the 9/11 Commission report, particularly focusing on Al-Hazmi and Midhar, as well as the fact that Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker, had in his pager the phone number of Bandar bin Sultan, the basically Saudi intelligence chief's holding company in Colorado, that they had 28 pages on this that were redacted from the public version. And the public was unable to read this until they were released years later after everybody had kind of forgotten about the whole thing. So Saudi Arabia got away with, I think, some involvement in the worst terror attack on American soil. If they can get away with that, they can probably get away with killing a Washington Post columnist in broad daylight. So,
well, and just to close the loop on the Islamophobia dimension of this too, I just also want to point out, in terms of their toxic effect in that area, that, you know, people love to, Islamophobes love to say, well, these Sunnis and Shias have been killing each other for centuries, which is actually not true.
no.
It's not at all true. It's a very recent development tied to what the Saudis have been doing. Or they say this kind of Wahhabi extremist Islam, that's the original Islam. It's only been around for the last couple hundred years or so. I don't know, I think it was the 19th century that Wahhab was writing. So this is historically new stuff, and very closely Wahhab and his successors worked with the Saudi so-called royal family and so on. This is really something.
And they worked with the British royal family. I mean, they worked with the British court as basically imperial proxies. So, I mean, and it's an imperial ideology that goes back to Ibn Taymiyyah, who was writing about, you know, the resistance against the Mongols. So, you know, but the point is that we're talking about an ideology. We're talking about state projection of it. We haven't even mentioned the key role the CIA played in weaponizing it in Afghanistan and elsewhere in Central Asia, from Chechnya to Bosnia. But the point is that the Islamophobes want to completely omit all context and position Wahhabism and its manifestation in genocidal Sunni jihadi groups like ISIS as the ultimate essence of Islam. And that's, you know, sort of the opposite of what we're doing. But unfortunately, you know, they're the ones who kind of control the narrative. And the real truth about it is so inconvenient to the American national security state that's why we see figures like Frank Gaffney, in my view, figures like Frank Gaffney, arch Islamophobe, one of the most prominent Islamophobes, getting funding from Raytheon. Getting funding from the defense industry. It's so much more convenient to just say, well, this is just Islam, and, you know, the U.S. has nothing to do with this.
Well, it's money well spent, because I remember immediately after the hijackings, these ads for Boeing. I don't know if they were formally or informally prepared. Now that you've used our airplanes, try these other fine Boeing products. And it was a list of pictures of missiles and so on. So, you know, it's working out great for them. It's working out great for the defense industry. It's working out great for the national security establishment. It's working out great for the politicians they work with.
It would not be working out as great. It would be still working out well, as great if 9/11 hadn't happened. I mean, we have to keep this in mind as the pivotal moment in everything we're talking about right now. And then, you know, what happened after 9/11? We went into Iraq. It was just like the catalyzing event referred to in the Project for a New American Century neocon blueprint. They said, short of some catalyzing event, we won't be able to fulfill these goals. Where then 9/11 happened, the catalyzing event. So their goal wasn't to attack Saudi Arabia, who had involvement. It was to, you know, take down the states that rejected America's sphere of influence, Iraq, and now it's Iran. Now Iran's on the target board. That's why Saudi Arabia is so important to us, and that's why they're playing ball with Israel.
Right, and you know, unfortunately, we don't have as much time as I would have liked to discuss the other topic, but the pivot here. Okay, Saudi pours money into think tanks like the Atlantic Council. Facebook decides a few months ago that it's going to partner with Atlantic Council, among other establishment elite groups, to determine what is or isn't permissible political speech on what has become one of the only forums or commons for public discussion we have anymore, which is social media. So you have, in effect, de facto establishment censorship, some of which is being funded by Saudi money and other corporate money and other money of
Atlantic
special
Council is
interest.
funded by Saudi Arabia.
That was my pivot here. So this, to me, this cannot end well for free speech.
It's not ending well. I mean, it is not really being discussed as a free speech issue, except by, people like us, who I think are like somewhere down the road targets in this purge of alternative media. But basically 800 sites and users were purged from Facebook. Some of them were legitimate alternative media sites. One of them, someone I know, Rachel Blevins, was sort of an independent journalist who kind of commentator, basically was presenting her views on Facebook and was getting a lot of followers. She had 70,000 followers. She never did anything that violated the terms of use. She wasn't using hate speech. She was just a normal person, and they purged her because she was affiliated with the Free Thought Project, which was purged in coordinated fashion by Twitter and Facebook. The Free Thought Project, like Cop Block and Policing the Police, these are groups that focused on police brutality in the U.S. The anti-media, they focused on U.S. empire. So, you're looking at a lot of sites that had exposed or focused on American state violence being targeted, while Facebook is partnering with the Atlantic Council, which is one of the most militaristic think tanks in town. And as you pointed out, it's funded by Saudi Arabia, but really functions as NATO's voice in Washington. And we probably don't have a lot of time, but this was all possible because of another catalyzing event. The catalyzing event being the election of Donald Trump and the narrative that Russia had installed him. And so we have the Russiagate narrative.
And who, just to close the loop, who took the lead role in instilling the narrative, not only that it was Russia that had installed him, but that we must now immediately purge both the right and left, even though the left had nothing to do with the installation of Donald Trump in any readily perceivable way, John Brennan, by issuing the OIC report that he issued before he left office with Barack Obama. True?
Yeah. There was also the ODNI report that Clapper released.
I'm sorry. I think I conflated Clapper and
well, Clapper,
and Brennan.
with
I did
with
conflate
full.
them, so thanks for the correction there.
Brennan played a role in that report, and basically, it singled out RT for fomenting radical discontent. But then we saw a series of initiatives since then, like Proper Not, this anonymous site that produced a blacklist of alternative media sites, calling them Kremlin influence agents. And then the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is focused on Russian bots and had an advisory board under the auspices of the U.S.-funded German Marshall Fund that included a who's who of neocons who were, Iraq war supporters, and liberal interventionists affiliated with the Hillary Clinton campaign and the Obama CIA. And basically, what they've done is created, I believe they've manufactured this fear of Russia sowing division in the U.S. through active measures online. They can't prove any of it. They've used the shabbiest tactics. I think, they've been exposed as this just gigantic flim-flam, but they've managed to sow enough fear that people are willing to accept the suppression of alternative media and have become confused and unable to distinguish between what Russian active measures are and what legitimate dissent is. And that's really the goal, is to suppress legitimate American dissent. So Russiagate created kind of the political space for them to start doing it. And we're seeing it happen in real time with the purging of these sites from the privately owned Silicon Valley platforms that represent, unfortunately, our digital commons. And nobody outside of us is really protesting this. To me, it is a free speech issue. It is about free media, and we do need a protest movement around it. And ultimately, we need to go back to the idea that you introduced in 2014. I don't know how you want to market it, but I would say nationalizing Facebook and Twitter and all of these platforms would be a damn good idea.
Well, that's a perfectly fine way to. That's not how I introduced it in 2014, although that was a headline given. But at that point, I'm pretty much there, and agree with you on that. And by the way, these technologies were created by the American people, often with the active participation of the intelligence services, as Yasha Levine has taken the lead in pointing out. He's been on the program too. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. There's so much more we can talk about, but my closing thought about it is that while Russia appears to be the target of all this rhetoric and all these investigations, the collateral damage that I suspect is the real target is dissent.
That's McCarthyism.
That is McCarthyism. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Max Blumenthal, writer, you've been doing great work as always, and great to talk to you.
Thanks a lot, RJ.